أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I sincerely welcome you to our first class this year, 2018, of Islamic law, Fiqh, the second part of Islamic law. Last year, we offered a total of 46 lessons. We started with the book of purity. Then we examined half of the book of Salah or prayer. This year, in Islamic law 02, we will examine the second half of the book of prayer, the book of Salah. Then we will examine some other books such as the book of fasting and also the book of Khums. Salah is the pillar of our faith. Therefore, it is extremely important for us to examine all the rulings or the majority of the rulings that surround Salah. Last year we examined the parts of Salah. In our chapter tonight, we're going to start by examining those acts that invalidate the Salah. We are ordering the books for those who have registered this year, for the new students. Those of you who have the book from last year, we are starting on page 186. Now the heading is called Mubtilat as-Salah. Mubtil, is that consistent with the edition that you have, page 186? Does anyone have the book from last year? So this is page 186, right? Yeah. So the heading is called Mubtilat as-Salah. Mubtil comes from the word batil, and you've heard the word batil, right? Assalamu alaikum. What does the word batil mean? It means invalid. When you hear someone saying, my salah became batil, or a transaction is batil, meaning it's invalid. So mubtil in Arabic means that which invalidates. So in this chapter, we're going to examine those acts that invalidate the salah. Before we examine these 8 or 9 actions that invalidate the salah, there is a very important point to consider about prayer. What we understand from the Sharia, from Islamic law, is that salah has a unity, such that when you start the salah with your takbir and all the way to the taslim, you have a solid, continuous connection. Just like when something is getting its power from electricity, right? When you plug something, it has that continuous power. The minute you disconnect it, it stops working. We can take salah as an example of something that continuously needs to be observed in a spiritual sense. So salah needs to have that continuous connection. These 8 or 9 actions that we will discuss invalidate the salah because they break that connection. Because many people could argue, well, if I do one of these acts, why can't I just stop and then continue after that? Or let's say if someone invalidates his wudu in salah, why can't I just stop, redo my wudu, and then continue from where I left off? It's because salah has that connection that is continuous and it must be maintained. Hence, any act that breaks this connection will invalidate the salah. So let's examine the first one. The first act that invalidates the salah is anything that negates or nullifies the wudu. So all the acts that break the wudu invalidate the salah. We have sahih hadiths from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them, that state this very clearly. So for example, if someone, while they're praying, commits one of those acts that invalidate the wudu, automatically the salah is broken. and one needs to redo their wudu and redo the salah. Now, this is the case even if one did not deliberately break their wudu. If it was not deliberate, yet it will invalidate the salah. Why? Those who attended Islamic law last year, we talked about the pillars. Remember Arkan al-Salah? One of the pillars of salah is tahara, purity, to be on wudu. That means if someone does not observe tahara or purity in salah, whether it was deliberate, they deliberately broke their wudu, or it was accidental, it was not deliberate, the salah is broken. The ruku' is also like that, the sujood is also like that. If someone forgets to do the ruku' in a salah, they forgot, it was not deliberate, the salah is invalid. Why? Because the ruku' is one of the pillars of salah. Hence, the first act that invalidates the salah is anything that invalidates the wudu itself. The salah is broken, and one must go redo the wudu and then continue their salah. Any questions on this first act that invalidates the salah? That invalidates the prayer? So whether it's deliberate or not, it doesn't matter. As soon as one commits one of those actions that invalidate the salah, invalidate the wudu, the salah is automatically broken. Because the condition of being pure with tahara on wudu is a pillar for the salah. At any second, if it's broken, the salah automatically is invalid. So that's number one. Number two is something that is called takattuf. Anyone knows what takattuf is? Takattuf is this practice which other schools of thought, other than the school of Ahlul Bayt, observe in salah, which is crossing your hands while praying. This is called takattuf in Islamic law. The other schools of thought, their ruling is that it's not mandatory, but they consider it highly mustahab, because their understanding is that the Prophet ﷺ used to do that. Of course, not all schools of thought agree. For example, the Maliki school of thought, their understanding is that the Prophet ﷺ used to pray while his hands were down. In Arabic, we call this isbal al-yadayn, when your hands are down. And he presents his argument. So they believe it is mustahab. We in the school of Ahlul Bayt, we believe that doing so invalidates the salah. So there are three opinions that Shia scholars have when it comes to crossing the hand. The first opinion is that it is haram to do it, meaning if you do it, it's a sin. And also it invalidates the salah. So if someone crosses his hand in the school of Ahlul Bayt, their salah would be invalidated, and they've also committed a sin. Because they're praying not according to the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prescribed to us. That in itself is a sin. That's one opinion. The second opinion of scholars states it's haram to cross your hand in salah, but it doesn't invalidate the salah. Unless someone does it with the intention that the Sharia requires this, which is the third opinion. So the first opinion says it's haram, it invalidates the salah. The second opinion says it's haram, it's a sin if you do that, but it doesn't have any consequences on your salah. Your salah is still valid. The third opinion of scholars states it's not haram, it does not invalidate your salah unless you cross your hand with the intention that Islam requires this. What does that mean? That means if someone crosses his hand because he's tired and that's a convenient position for him. Let's say someone, his hands are extremely fatigued, and if he keeps them hanging, it's going to cause him more fatigue. So he would like to cross his hands like that. But he's not doing it because Islam requires it. He's just doing it because it's convenient for him. There are some scholars who said, that's fine. It's not haram, it does not invalidate the salah. Because you're not doing it under the assumption that Islam requires this. Now, why does it make a difference? The reason why this makes a difference is because if Islam does not recognize crossing your hand as part of salah or even mustahab, if you do that with the intention that it is part of salah, Islam does require it, you're innovating, you're inserting into religion something that does not exist. That itself becomes haram. That in itself invalidates the prayer. And that's problematic. I'll give you a very common example. The color of your dress, of your garment when you pray. Does Islam impose a specific color on you? It doesn't. There are mustahab colors to observe in salah. One of them, for example, is white. But there isn't any obligation. You can observe a fully proper salah with any color. Black, red, white, blue. Now, if someone stands and says, I am observing the color red because Islam requires me to, and with this intention they pray, scholars say that salah is invalid. Why? Because you're inserting into religion something that's not there. You're playing with religious rules. That will cause your salah to be invalid. Whereas if you pray while wearing a blue shirt and someone asks you why, you're like, it has nothing to do with salah. I just like to observe this shirt. I'm not claiming that I have to be in this shirt while praying. So when it comes to crossing the hand, some scholars are of the opinion that if you just do it out of convenience, out of your own preference, that's fine. But if you do it with the intention that this is mustahab, recommended, Islam recommends this or requires this, it invalidates the salah. So these are the three opinions that we have when it comes to crossing the hands. Which one is the most popular opinion among Shia scholars? The most popular opinion amongst Maraji and scholars in the Shia school of thought is the first opinion. That crossing your hand in salah is haram and invalidates the salah. Why? What is the reasoning behind this? As for us in the school of Ahlul Bayt, we have a hadith from Al-Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam on page 187. The author of the book discusses the hadith. For those who just walked in, we will give you the books. Inshallah, we have ordered them. We will give them to you next week, inshallah. Some of you might have them from last year. This is on page 187. So the author gives us a hadith from Al-Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam. Su'il Al-Imam Al-Sadiq alayhi salam. The Imam was asked, عن رجل صلى ويده اليمنى على اليسرى. He was asked about a man who prayed and his right arm was on his left arm, meaning he was crossing his hands. فقال ذلك التكفير. The Imam alayhi salam stated, this is the act of takfir, or some call it takattuf. It has two names in Arabic. فَلَا تَفْعَلْ. The Imam alayhi salam said, do not do this. This act of crossing your hand, do not do it. Now for those who attended legal theory last year, when in an act of ibadah, in an act of worship, if the Imam alayhi salam prohibits us from doing something in an act of salah, in an act of worship, what does that necessitate? Don't do it. What if I do it? What happens? Not only is it haram because I'm disobeying the sharia, it also invalidates the act of worship. We talked about this rule in legal theory. When it comes to transactions, like don't buy and don't sell. On Friday, the Quran says, on Friday, when Salatul Jum'ah is being conducted, فَذَرُوا الْبَيْعِ. Avoid buying or selling. Let's say someone says, you know what, I don't want to go to Friday prayer. Even when it's wajib during the time of the Ma'soom, let's say. Even during the time of the Prophet ﷺ. I want to stay in my store and conduct business. They're violating this command. So that's a sin. But their act of buying and selling, is it invalid? No. Because it's a transaction. It's not an act of worship that requires niyyah. It does not require, when you buy and sell, do you have to sell qurbatan ila Allah ta'ala for the sake of God? No, you don't have to. That's not one of the requirements of buying and selling. Whereas when it comes to acts of worship, in order for any act of worship to be accepted by God, to be valid, it has to be done with niyyah, with the intention for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. How can you observe a proper intention when you're being prohibited from doing so? If the Imam alayhi salam says, do not pray in this area, and the Imam is acting on behalf of God, well, how can you offer a salah here while through this salah you're disobeying God? It doesn't work that way. That salah would be invalid. So when the Imam alayhi salam says, فَلَا تَفْعَلْ, do not cross your hands, scholars will say, we use this law, that prohibition in acts of worship necessitates what? Invalidity. It's invalid, then the salah is invalid. So that's our proof in the school of Ahlul Bayt. Now let's present a brief overview of why we have this difference between the madahib. This issue of takattuf, of crossing the hands. Is this something the Prophet ﷺ observed or not? First of all, we really have in Sunni sources two hadiths that are commonly cited that talk about crossing the hands. The first one is in Sahih Bukhari, in the book of Bukhari, and this hadith is narrated by a companion of the Prophet ﷺ by the name of Sahl ibn Sa'd as-Sa'idi. Some of you may have heard him. He's that old companion who saw Imam Zayn al-Abidin alayhi salam and the caravan of Imam Hussein enter Damascus. Sahl ibn Sa'd as-Sa'idi. And by the way, he had a lot of respect for Imam Ali alayhi salam. He says, these are his words in Arabic. He says, Kunna nu'maru bit-takattuf, basically. Assalamu alaikum. He says, we were commanded to cross our hands. That's what he says in Bukhari. Let's analyze this hadith. Who commanded you? We were commanded. You see the way he even phrases it? You can tell from the phrasing that it wasn't the Prophet, it was the political establishment at the time, and he doesn't want to be explicit about it for safety purposes, right? Because he doesn't want to get in trouble with the authorities. If this was something so clear that the Prophet did every day, why would you word it in a vague way like that? Kunna nu'mar, we were commanded. So he's not telling us who. So this hadith, in the science of hadith, is a broken hadith. He's not telling us who his source is. Who commanded you? Another sahabi? The Prophet commanded you? Who? Tell us who is commanding you. When you keep it vague like that, that's not a valid hadith in the science of hadith. So we cannot cite this hadith in Bukhari to verify that the Prophet used to pray that way and we have to pray that way. If someone comes from the Middle East, from Najaf, from Qom, from wherever, and they tell you, we were commanded there to do this, would you just take that hadith blindly? Or would you question him? Excuse me, what do you mean we were commanded? Who commanded you? The political authorities, the guys in the hawza, the marji', your friends, who? Tell us who. So this is the hadith that we have in Bukhari, and this hadith falls short of establishing that the Prophet ﷺ used to observe the takattuf. So we cannot rely on this hadith. There is another hadith in Sahih Muslim. That one's also problematic. Why? Because that hadith is attributed to a companion who showed up during the last days of the Prophet's life. How many times did the Prophet pray in front of Muslims in the masjid? Just the wajib prayer, let alone the mustahab prayers. How many times? At least 5 times a day. We don't have any other companion telling us the Prophet would cross his hands like that until this companion comes at the end of the Prophet's life to tell us, oh, I saw the Prophet praying like that. This casts doubts on his hadith. This is not something that he only would see. This is something thousands of companions would see. None of them report. None of them, other than this Sahl ibn Sa'd as-Sa'idi, who says we were commanded. No one else has claimed the Prophet would cross his hands. except this companion who shows up at the end of the Prophet's life. Why? This is something that should have been reported, because other companions, as we shall see later, even in Sunni books of sources, they documented the details of the Prophet's prayer. How he would do the takbir, how he would do the ruku', how he would do the sujood. They documented all those details. How come they never made mention of the crossing the hands? When the natural state of standing is to put your hands down, right? If you're just standing normally, you normally put your hands down. So if the Prophet was crossing his hands, that's a detail they should not have missed out. So we see thousands of companions not missing out on these details, except this companion who comes at the end of the Prophet's life. So we don't have a valid, authentic hadith, even in Sunni sources, that confirms that the Prophet ﷺ would pray that way. The third point over here is that Al-Imam Malik ibn Anas, the leader of the Maliki school of thought, he says, look, forget these hadiths that we have. They're conflicting and everyone's arguing in a certain way. He says, in Medina, which is the very city of the Prophet ﷺ, I saw the people of my time, most of them would pray while their hands would be down. And when you would ask them why, they would say, that's how our parents prayed and grandparents. So he says, I conclude from the action of the people of Medina that the Prophet ﷺ would pray while his hands were down. Otherwise, why did the people of Medina decide to pray that way? They learned it from the previous generation, and the previous generation learned it from the Prophet ﷺ. That in itself is a strong clue that indicates the Prophet would pray with his hands down. Another argument that we have here is that even when you look at Sunni sources, they have so many contradictions when it comes to how you cross your hand. What is the proper method of it? Each school of thought gives you a different position of how your hands should be in. Why all these discrepancies? If the Prophet really observed that and so many thousands of Muslims saw him, this is not something we should disagree over. So all of these really makes us cast doubt on whether the Prophet ﷺ did that. Just looking at their sources. Of course, we the followers of Ahlul Bayt, we take our teachings from the Imams of Ahlul Bayt, and they made it very clear that this invalidates the Salah. Now, one final point about crossing the hand. The other schools of thought who believe in crossing the hand, do they say it's wajib, it's mandatory, or do they say it's mustahab? They say it's mustahab. They don't say it's wajib. Hanafis, well, Malikis obviously, but Hanafis, Shafi'is, they don't say it's wajib. They say it's mustahab, it's recommended. Now my question for you is this. If something is disputed, we don't know whether the Prophet did it, so we should also observe it, and it's mustahab. Or the Prophet did not do it, so if we do it, it's going to invalidate our salah. What does the law of precaution say? If you doubt whether something is mustahab, Allah wants it from you or not, or no, it's haram, I shouldn't. What does the law of precaution state? Stay away from it, don't do it. Why? Because if you do it, and it turns out to be that's not part of salah, your salah is invalid. But if it turned out to be that it's mustahab, your salah is still valid, because you have not violated any parts of salah. It's just a mustahab that you did not observe. So what's the safest way when it comes to crossing the hands? Don't do it. And that's our argument with other schools of thought. With all these doubts and all these discrepancies, why insist on doing something that is doubtful? That we're not really sure the Prophet ﷺ observed it or not. The intellectual law of precaution states that it is safer not to do it. Because if you don't do it, your salah is valid. Whether it was mustahab or not, your salah is valid. Whereas, if it's not really mustahab and the Prophet did not observe it, and we're doing it with the intention that it is part of salah, that potentially could invalidate the salah. So the law of precaution in itself dictates to us not to observe it. So, yes, sister.
I understood that the Sunni school of thought, they cross their hands because of either Uthman or Abu Bakr. Okay,
that's a very good observation. There is a discussion that this was not existing at the time of the Prophet ﷺ. At the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab, when his armies occupied Persia and they brought in the Persian prisoners of war, the Persians, whose religion was Majus, that's what, it's a type of Zoroastrianism, right? In their religion, when they would stand before their gods, they would cross their hands. So when those prisoners of wars, the Persian prisoners of war, when they were summoned to stand before the Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab, that's how they stood. He asked them, why are you standing this way? They're like, that's our sign of respect to you. He's like, well, if this is the sign of respect, then we should do this to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now this incident is documented in history, but it's disputed whether the chain of it is valid or not. So you will find Sunni scholars who will try to dispute this. They're like, no, the sources that narrate this are not authentic sources in their eyes. That's why I did not mention it as one of the arguments that we'd use with the other schools of thought. So we in the Shia school of thought, yes, we believe that this piece of evidence is valid because our sources confirm it. But many schools of thought from other than the Ahlul Bayt, they don't accept this. Or at least they doubt the authenticity of it. But yes, we actually do have that as a piece of evidence in history.
So it's a mutawatir hadith then for us or not?
That this happened with Umar? No, it's not a mutawatir hadith. Mutawatir hadith means such a widely reported hadith that it gives you 100% certainty. No, it's not one of those hadiths. Right. For us, what is mutawatir, what is established beyond doubt, is that the Prophet did not cross his hands. But this incident with the Persians and Umar ibn al-Khattab, while we have valid evidence for it, but we cannot call it a mutawatir hadith. It's not a mutawatir hadith. So that is also a very good observation. You see many scholars actually bring up this point, that this is something that was introduced by the Persians and the second caliph sanctioned it. And we believe you have no right to sanction. If Allah has determined salah for you, on what basis are you adding things into salah? That's not acceptable. So this is the second act that invalidates the salah, crossing one's hand. The third act that invalidates the salah is for someone to deliberately turn their face or body from the Qibla. Let's say you're standing towards the Qibla direction of the Kaaba, and then deliberately, purposely, you shift your face. You shift your body to another direction. Even if it's a little, but you're deliberately doing it, that invalidates the salah. What about if you do not do it deliberately? If someone mistakenly moved while praying, they moved their position. If you moved your face slightly to the right, slightly to the left, less than 90 degrees into each direction, a right angle, right? If it's within that 180 degrees from east to west, you're okay. Because you did not deliberately change your face, then your salah is valid. Because it was not deliberate.
Just your face? So if you change
yes.
your body with your face,
So that's the face. When it comes to the body, the scholars have a little bit more strict rules. They would say if your body shifts a little bit, that's fine. But if it shifts too much, such that you're no longer facing the Kaaba anymore, that would invalidate the salah. But if your body is towards the Qibla and your face slightly shifts, you're still considered technically facing the Kaaba. So they make a distinction between the body and the face. Now if you completely shift away from the Kaaba, let's say this is the Qibla, and then in Salah, it was not deliberate, right? And then in Salah you turn exactly to the other side, 90 degrees. Or you put your back towards the Qibla, the Salah is invalidated. Even if it was not deliberate. Even if it was accidental. Let's say someone called on you, you thought it was an emergency, or someone scared you, you just jumped to the opposite side. The salah becomes invalid. So this is the ruling when it comes to facing away from the Qibla if it's not deliberate. Now, if someone accidentally shifted away from the Qibla and the time for Salah still continues, meaning you're doing your Salat al-Asr, it's not sunset yet, so you would have to repeat it because you completely shifted away from the Kaaba. But many scholars state, if you did not have time to redo your Salah and the sun set, or let's say it was Salat al-Subuh and the sun rose, so the time expired, then your Salah is valid. Many scholars do say that. So it really, depends whether the time is, expired or not. But if you completely shifted away from the Qibla, meaning your back was towards the Qibla, then that Salah is invalid regardless whether the time continues or not. You would have to redo it if the time still exists. If the time expired, you have to do it qada. But if it was not to that point, then if the time expired and you did not have time to redo it, so many scholars would say it's a valid Salah. Yes, brother.
Valid for Salat Jama'ah and Furada?
This law applies to both Salat al-Furada, individual prayer, and also Salat al-Jama'ah. If you were in Jama'ah and you completely shifted away from the Qibla, yes, your Salah becomes invalid. So this is the third act that would invalidate the Salah. Any questions on this third act? Yes, brother.
You talked about rotation. What about shifting left and right or maintaining?
Okay, that's a very good question. What about moving? We'll talk about this when we examine the last condition, but very briefly. If your movements are very small and short and brief, like a few steps forward, a few steps backward, a few steps to the right, a few steps to the left, that's fine. That does not invalidate the Salah, but you have to be careful. While you're making those steps, you don't recite if you're in Hamd or in the Surah. So if you're saying Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, then you had to move for whatever reason. That's fine. You could move a little bit, a few steps. But as you're moving, stop the recitation. Then once you're fixed again, you're standing stable, continue the recitation. Because any recitation, for it to be valid, you have to be fixed. You cannot be moving. So yes, we can take a few steps. Now, scholars have not designated how many steps. They've briefly stated that taking too many steps that would give the impression that you're no longer praying, you're out of Salah mode, let's say, would invalidate the Salah. So just a few steps here and there, that's fine. Or even sometimes if you have to pick something up, that's very important. Stop the recitation, do that, that's fine. We'll talk about this. The Prophet ﷺ sometimes would do it. He would carry a child sometimes who would be crying, or if there's a snake, the Prophet would, with a stick, push it away so it doesn't come and sting the people who are praying. So limited actions like that, we'll discuss them later, inshallah. Next, on Wednesday, we will discuss some of these actions that do not invalidate the Salah. So small movements here and there, that is okay.
What about if you're flying or in a ship, it's moving?
Regarding in a ship or something that is moving, we discussed this last year in detail.
Right.
If it's pretty stable, such that the ground is not shaking, you can maintain your balance, the Salah is valid. But if it's shaking and moving such that you're not maintaining your balance, no, then that would invalidate the Salah. Unless you're stuck. You're stuck on a ship and you don't have any other option, that's a different situation there. So that's the third act that invalidates the Salah. The fourth act, to deliberately talk in Salah, even if it's one word, even if it's a one-letter word. In English, do we have a one-letter word? Yeah, which is what? A, the indefinite article, right? A. In Arabic, we have a lot of one-letter words. Fi, qi, for example, which is a command form. Fi means observe your promise, observe something. Qi means protect. It comes from wuqaya. So the command form becomes qi. See, even these are one letters, but that's speech, because you're communicating something. So whenever you deliberately talk in Salah, any speech that is not related to the dua or to the Salah, that invalidates the Salah. Yes, if you accidentally spoke. Let's say you were praying in your room, someone walked in and they asked you, where did you put the keys? And you inadvertently, without realizing it, on the table, you just said it. You blurted it out. And then you realize, oh, I'm in my salah. Your salah is valid. Why? Because it's not deliberate. When it comes to speech, deliberate speech invalidates the salah. But anything that's not deliberate, out of forgetfulness, out of unawareness, is okay. What about answering the salam of the one who says salam to you? We have a hadith from Muhammad ibn Muslim. This is on page 188. Muhammad ibn Muslim was a great top scholar and companion of an Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam and an Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. Muhammad ibn Muslim says in this hadith, once I went into a room in which Al-Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq alayhi salam was praying. فَقُلْتُ السَّلَامُ عَلَيْكَ. I saluted him with the salam. فَقَالَ السَّلَامُ عَلَيْكَ. He responded to me by saying Assalamu alayk. Then I asked him, كَيْفَ أَصْبَحْتَ. How are you? How are you doing today? He said, the Imam, he just continued. He kept silent. He did not respond to me. Then when he finished his prayer, he explained to me. He told me, oh Muhammad ibn Muslim, whenever someone says salam to you, reply to them in the exact same manner, in the exact same salutation that they gave you, and don't answer any other questions. So if someone said Assalamu alaykum, don't say in your salah wa alaykum as-salam. That invalidates the salah according to many scholars. Because we have to stick to the hadith of the Imam. He told him, reply to him exactly with the wording that he used. So someone said Assalamu alaykum, say Assalamu alaykum. Someone said Assalamu alaykum wa rahmatullah, you can stick to that, that's fine. But don't change it. Someone says Assalamu alaykum wa alaykum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. That invalidates the salah. So make sure that you respond exactly how you were saluted. By the way, this only applies to salam. If someone greeted you another way, good morning, good afternoon, sabbahkumullah bil khair, this does not apply. You cannot respond while you're in salah. That would invalidate the salah. The only exception is the salam. Yes, brother. Someone had a question? Yes.
So if you don't respond at all, that's okay too?
Okay, if someone doesn't respond, that's a sin. Because responding to the salam is wajib in Islam. It doesn't invalidate your salah. Let's say someone says, you know what, I don't want to answer. Fine, your salah is valid, but you committed a sin by not responding to the salam. So it's wajib, remember, it's wajib. If you're, okay, now if you're alone in that room and someone directly said the salam to you, you have to respond. But if you're in a gathering, let's say you're in a room and 5 other people are in the room, someone said salam, another person answered. You can no longer answer. You have no right to answer. If someone else answered, then the salam has been addressed, has been answered, you can no longer address it. If it's addressed specifically to you and no one else is answering it, then you would have to answer it.
But how would you know if it's really addressed to you if you are focused on your prayer at that point and somebody...
If you became aware, if somehow you became aware that it was addressed to you, then you respond. But if you're not paying attention and you're focusing on your salah, that's fine. Allah won't hold you responsible, even if it turned out that he was saying salam to you, but you were not responding. What about children? If a child says salam to you. I know some kids, to distract the parents, as soon the parents go into salah, Salamu alaikum baba, Salamu alaikum baba. They do that. Scholars have said children who are not mature, you cannot respond to them in your salah. That will invalidate your salah. However, children who are mature, we call them the mumayyaz. We talked about this last year, who is the mumayyaz. Basically, a child who's around 8, 9, 10 years old, who can decide right from wrong. You know, they begin to understand and they know right from wrong. We call them mumayyaz in Islamic law. Many scholars have said yes, as a precaution, if a child who's 10, who's 11, of course for girls the age of maturity is 9, so obviously 9 and over you would have to respond to them. But let's say a boy, or a girl who's 8, but she's mature. She knows right from wrong. If they say salam to you, as a precaution, many maraja would say respond to them. But yes, if a child is 4, 5, even 6, then no. If they say salam to you, you are not to respond to them in salah. So salam alaikum is speech. It's not part of salah, but it's an exception. The Imams have mentioned that this is an exception. When someone greets you, greet them back, even if you are in your salah.
So is it preferable not to say salam if somebody's praying, you see?
Okay, that's a very good question. If you see someone praying and you're wondering, should I say salam or it's best not to distract him? It's makruh, unrecommended to say salam to someone who's praying because you're going to distract them, right? So it's not haram. You can say salam to them and that's fine. But it is undesired. It's makruh, it's unrecommended, which means it's better to avoid it. But sometimes you're not aware of it, right? Sometimes you see someone in the room standing, you just naturally say salamu alaikum, and then you realize, oh, okay, this person's praying. That's fine. But if you know that someone is praying, it's better to keep away from saying salam to them. Yes?
It's like if somebody walked into the room while I was praying, they said salamu alaikum Ali, do I have to respond back with salamu alaikum?
No. If someone says salamu alaikum and then they bring your name, salamu alaikum Ali, all you say is salamu alaikum. Don't add anything that is not part of the salam itself. So when I say use their same exact wording, I don't mean that if they add extra things that are not part of the salam, you also add them back. No. You stick to the salam, but the arrangement of words, salamu alaikum, alaikum as-salam, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, that's where you have to observe the same wording that they use. So if they mention your name, no, don't mention their name. Just say salamu alaikum. Scholars have even said if they said salamun alaikum or assalamu alaikum, because these are two Arabic forms of the salam, stick to the form that they used with you. Yeah. So be specific with the form that you use. Any other questions on the salam? So this is the fourth act that invalidates the salah, which is talking deliberately. The fifth act that invalidates the salah is what is called al-qahqaha. Qahqaha in Arabic is to laugh out loud or to guffaw. That invalidates the salah because we have a clear hadith from the Imam alayhi salam in which he says وَأَمَّا الْقَهْقَهَةُ فَهِيَ تَقْطَعُ الصَّلَاةِ. The Imam says laughing out loud invalidates your salah. Smiling does not invalidate the salah. Even if it's a big smile. As long as you're not making a voice, you're not laughing out loud, you're not guffawing, it's okay. The salah is valid. But the minute you actually laugh with a voice, for whatever reason, even if it was not deliberate, right? That invalidates the salah. Let's say someone does something and you just, uncontrollably laugh, right? Someone cracks a joke, and sometimes people, how they pray, they're hearing everything that's around them, and you just crack up and you start laughing. Even if it was not deliberate, but that invalidates the salah. So the fifth act that invalidates the salah, even if you did not do it deliberately, just naturally happened, is to laugh out loud. Yes?
So is this restricted just to laughter or any other sound? Like, what if you cried?
We'll talk about crying. So, if someone makes a sound, let's say like coughing or any other sound, that's not speech, it's not laughter, and it's not crying, it does not invalidate the salah. The three types of voices or noises that invalidate the salah is speech, anything that people consider, okay, he's talking, it's speech. That, if it's deliberate, breaks the salah. Laughing out loud, deliberate or not deliberate, breaks the salah. Crying also invalidates the salah. We'll examine. That's the sixth one. So the fifth one is laughing or guffawing. The sixth one is crying, again loudly. Sometimes people can cry silently. You could see the tears coming down. That does not invalidate the salah. Crying loudly with a voice, if it's for a worldly matter, like losing money in your business, having a fight with your friend or spouse, or the death of a loved one. If in your salah you find yourself crying, with a voice, due to the loss of a loved one, that invalidates the salah.
But if it's not without the
But
voice?
if it's not without the voice, just tears, that's fine. That does not invalidate the salah. We're talking about crying ma'a sawt, with a voice. If it's silent crying, it does not invalidate the salah. Now we have a hadith that makes an exception. And scholars have observed this hadith. The hadith states if you're crying for a religious reason or anything that has to do with the akhirah, such as heaven, hell, the fear of God, or the tragedies of the Ahlul Bayt, peace be upon them. If it's not too, sometimes some people, they cry very violently, right? Very severely, where that takes them out of the mode of salah. That invalidates the salah. But if it's just normal crying, even if it's with a voice, if it's for a religious reason, or in other words, a godly reason, then it does not invalidate the salah. So scholars have made a distinction, crying for a worldly thing, or something that is related to the akhirah, related to religion. If you're crying for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, loving God, fearing God, the Ahlul Bayt, the Day of Judgment. In fact, the Imam alayhi salam in one hadith, he says, فَذَاكَ أَفْضَلُ الْأَعْمَالِ فِي الصَّلَاةِ. If in your salah you remember that you're standing before your God on the Day of Judgment, and as a result you start crying, like sometimes the Imams of Ahlul Bayt would cry in their salah, the Imam says that's the best of deeds, because it indicates that your heart is humble, your heart is sincere in salah. So the sixth act that invalidates the salah is to cry for worldly matters. And when we say cry, we mean loud crying, not silent crying. Silent crying does not invalidate your salah. Any questions on that?
Sayyid, even if
Yes.
the silent cry is in regards to something worldly?
Yes, even if the silent cry is regarding something worldly, like the death of a loved one. You're not making any noises, you're just shedding tears. Silent crying, that does not invalidate salah, that's fine. Next, we will examine the remaining acts that invalidate the salah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين. اللهم صل على